Everyone thinks the hard part is making money. They're wrong. Making money, at least in the modern economy, is genuinely easier than it has ever been in human history. You can learn a skill on YouTube, sell a service on Fiverr, build an audience on social media, and earn your first $1,000 in ways that would have seemed like science fiction 30 years ago. The information is free. The platforms are free. The barriers to entry have never been lower. The hard part isn't getting the money in. The hard part is keeping it from leaking out. And here's the brutal, uncomfortable truth that nobody in the financial industry wants to say out loud. The average American doesn't have a savings problem. They don't have an income problem. They have a spending reflex problem. And that reflex, that twitching, itching, dopamine-soaked compulsion to click buy now, is costing the median household somewhere between $40,000 and $100,000 per decade. Not because they're stupid, not because they're lazy, but because they are fighting a billion-dollar industry with nothing but willpower. And willpower, as you're about to understand, is the worst possible weapon you could bring to that fight. This is not a budgeting article. Budgets don't work. Everyone knows it. The diet industry and the budgeting industry have one thing in common. They sell tools that require infinite willpower to operate, and they profit from your repeated failures. A new diet book every January, a new budgeting app every February. The same people, the same struggles, the same result. What we're talking about today is something different, something rooted not in willpower, not in discipline, not in some vague exhortation to spend less and save more, but in the actual chemistry of your brain and the physics of economic gravity. We're talking about a rule so simple it fits on a Post-it note, so powerful it can compound into millions of dollars over a lifetime, and so counterintuitive that almost nobody uses it seriously. 72 hours, 3 days. That's it. That's the rule. Before you buy anything non-essential that you didn't plan to buy, you wait 72 hours. You don't delete it. You don't tell yourself you can't have it. You just wait. 3 days. And then you decide. Simple, right? Laughably simple. Almost insultingly simple. So why doesn't everyone do it? Because simple and easy are not the same thing. And understanding why they aren't the same thing, understanding the physics, the biology, and the cold mathematics of the system you're living inside is the difference between someone who reads this and thinks, that's interesting, and someone who reads this and genuinely changes the trajectory of their financial life. Let's start with the physics. There's a concept in orbital mechanics called escape velocity. If you want to launch a rocket from the surface of the Earth and send it into space, you don't just need to go fast enough. You need to exceed a very specific threshold, approximately 11.2 kilometers per second, or gravity pulls you back. It doesn't matter how hard you try. It doesn't matter how motivated you are. If you don't hit that number, you come back down. Every time. Now think about consumer debt. Think about the average American household, carrying roughly $17,000 in credit card debt at an average interest rate of somewhere between 20 and 24% annually. That's not a problem you can solve by being more careful. That's not a problem you solve by cutting out your morning coffee. That's gravity. That's a structural force pulling money down and away from you faster than most people can earn it back. At 22% annual interest, that's $17,000 grows by roughly $3,740 every single year you don't pay it off. That's more than $1,000 every 100 days, purely in interest, just sitting there, compounding, pulling you back toward the surface no matter how hard you row. The people who escape aren't the ones who tried harder. They're the ones who understood the physics first and then built a system capable of generating escape velocity. The 72-hour rule is not a budgeting trick. It's a launch system. It's a mechanism designed to interrupt gravitational pull at the exact moment it's strongest, the moment of purchase intent, and buy your prefrontal cortex enough time to do its job before your limbic system spends your money for you. But before we get into the mechanics of why the rule works, we need to talk about why you're in this position in the first place. Because the conventional wisdom says this is your fault. Your lack of self-control, your poor financial literacy, your inability to delay gratification. And if you believe that narrative, if you accept that framing, you will spend the rest of your life treating symptoms instead of causes. The truth is, you are not fighting yourself. You are fighting an industrial machine that has spent decades and billions of dollars specifically engineering your vulnerability. And it's a machine that charges you extra for the privilege of being poor. Here's what Terry Pratchett understood intuitively, and what economists have since formalized in decades of data. Being poor is expensive. Not just inconvenient, mathematically, structurally, brutally expensive. Sam Vimes, the fictional commander of the Night Watch in Pratchett's Discworld series, articulated what has since become known in behavioral economics as the Boots theory of socioeconomic unfairness. A man who can only afford $30 boots will buy them 3 times in 5 years, spending $90 total. A man who can afford $100 boots at the start buys them once in 5 years and still has them in 10. The richer man spent less. This isn't a metaphor. This is a structural penalty for not having capital. Run this math through every domain of consumer life, and the numbers become genuinely staggering. If you have good credit, you finance a car at 4% interest. If you have bad credit, you finance at 18%. On a $20,000 vehicle over 5 years, that difference translates to roughly $8,000 in additional interest payments on the exact same car, for the exact same service. The only variable is your credit score, which is, in large part, a function of your starting capital. If you have a grocery store nearby and cash to buy in bulk, you pay roughly $2.50 per pound for chicken breasts. If you're in a food desert and buying small quantities at a convenience store, you pay $4 to $5 per pound for the exact same protein. The penalty for having less is paying more per unit of every single thing you buy. If you rent month to month because you can't afford a long-term lease deposit, you pay a premium. If you can't afford to maintain your car properly, the small repair you skip becomes the catastrophic repair that wipes out your emergency fund. If you don't have an emergency fund, the catastrophic repair goes on a credit card at 22%. The poverty trap isn't a character flaw. It's a compound interest problem working in reverse against you every single day. Now add impulse purchasing to this system. The average American made roughly 83 impulse purchases per year, according to pre-pandemic retail data. The average impulse purchase was somewhere between $30 and $100. Conservative estimate? That's $3,000 per year in unplanned spending. At 22% credit card interest, if those purchases go on revolving debt, you're not spending $3,000. You're spending $3,000 plus an annual compound interest burden that, if not paid off, continues to grow. Over a decade with compounding, $3,000 a year in impulse purchases financed on credit doesn't cost you $30,000. It costs you something closer to $50,000 or $60,000, depending on your interest rate, your payment behavior, and how much of it is truly discretionary versus truly recurring. This is not a rounding error. This is not an edge case. This is the mechanism by which ordinary, intelligent, working people remain financially fragile their entire adult lives. Not because they lack ambition, not because they lack income, but because they are swimming against a mathematically designed current and nobody ever taught them about escape velocity. So why doesn't willpower work? Why can't smart people, and you are smart, the fact that you're reading this means you're already in the top percentile of people thinking about this, simply decide to stop buying things impulsively and then do that? Because the moment you want to buy something, you are no longer operating primarily from your prefrontal cortex. You're operating from your nucleus accumbens. Here's the neurochemistry, stated plainly. When you see something you want, a product, a deal, a limited time offer, your brain releases dopamine. Not when you get the thing, when you see it, when you anticipate it. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter of anticipation, not of satisfaction. It's the chemical that says, that thing over there will make you feel better. It's the gas pedal. And when that dopamine hits, the rational, long-term planning functions of your prefrontal cortex get partially suppressed. Not completely, but enough. Enough to make, I'll think about it later, feel physically uncomfortable. Enough to make the add to cart button feel like relief. The e-commerce industry knows this. They have known it for decades. Every design choice in a modern online store is built around a single objective. Maximize dopamine release and minimize the gap between that release and your credit card number. The countdown timer on a sale isn't there to inform you. It's there to spike your cortisol, the stress hormone, and trigger scarcity panic. The only three left in stock notification isn't inventory management, it's a loss aversion trigger. The one-click checkout, the saved payment details, the seamless mobile experience, all of it is friction removal, specifically designed to eliminate the time between wanting and buying before your prefrontal cortex can intervene. You are not weak, you are targeted. And it gets worse, because this system doesn't just catch you at your best, it catches you at your worst. And there's a reason the worst is more often than you think. Scarcity, genuine financial scarcity, the lived experience of not having enough, has a measurable, documented impact on cognitive function. Researchers Sendil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir published landmark research on this topic, demonstrating that people operating under conditions of financial scarcity showed cognitive performance reductions equivalent to losing approximately 13 IQ points. 13 points. That's the difference between average and borderline. The mechanism is what they called bandwidth consumption. When your mind is preoccupied with financial stress, with calculating whether you can cover rent, whether the car will last another month, whether the credit card payment will clear, those calculations consume working memory and executive function resources that would otherwise be available for decision-making. In other words, the stress of being financially tight makes you measurably worse at the financial decisions that would relieve the stress. This is not irony. This is a trap. And the trap has a biological reinforcement mechanism. When you are stressed, when cortisol is elevated, when you're in what neuroscientists call a threat state, your brain seeks relief. Fast. Dopamine is fast relief. The predictable, immediate dopamine hit of purchasing something, anything, is one of the most accessible forms of what psychologists call self-regulation. You buy something small, you get a hit, the stress momentarily recedes. The purchase doesn't solve the financial problem. It makes it infinitesimally worse on the margin. But the brain doesn't care about margins. The brain cares about right now. And right now, that $30 item just made you feel better for 11 minutes. This is the consumption trap. It's not stupidity. It's biology operating exactly as designed under conditions of stress. The problem is that the same mechanism that evolved to give our ancestors a burst of motivation to pursue food and shelter is now being used to sell us things we don't need, on credit we can't afford, while we're in a psychological state that makes us less capable of evaluating the decision clearly. The 72-hour rule is, at its core, a biological intervention. It's not about being disciplined. It's about understanding when your brain is compromised and installing a delay that gives your prefrontal cortex time to come back online. Here's what happens neurochemically when you wait 72 hours. The initial dopamine spike from seeing the product, the anticipatory rush, dissipates within hours, sometimes within minutes. The counterfeit urgency created by countdown timers and scarcity signals fades when those signals are no longer in your visual field. The cortisol spike associated with, "I might miss out," normalizes. And when you return to the item 72 hours later, you are, in a very real neurochemical sense, a different evaluator than the one who put it in the cart. Studies on purchase satisfaction consistently show that a significant portion, varying by product category, but often between 30 and 50%, of impulse purchases are regretted within days. Not because the product was bad, because the desire evaporated, because the emotional state that generated the desire was temporary, because in 72 hours, the architecture of the want had dissolved, and what was left was just an object you didn't actually need. The wealthy person and the financially struggling person can see the exact same product, at the exact same price, in the exact same sale. The difference in their response is not intelligence. It is not even discipline in the traditional sense. It is the relationship between current financial stress and the capacity for delayed evaluation. The person with a 6-month emergency fund and 0 revolving debt can evaluate the purchase calmly because their brain is not in threat mode. The stress hormones aren't spiking. The relief purchase mechanism isn't triggering. They're simply asking, "Do I want this?" without the cognitive distortion of scarcity anxiety. The person carrying $2,000 in credit card debt with $300 until payday is asking the same question. but their brain is running on a completely different operating system, one characterized by elevated cortisol, suppressed prefrontal function, and a powerful biological drive toward immediate relief. The purchase isn't just a purchase, it's medicine for a stress response that the purchase will, in the medium term, make worse. The 72-hour rule doesn't fix the underlying stress. We'll get to what does. But it provides a structural interruption that short-circuits the automatic pathway between want and buy, and gives the higher functions of your mind a fighting chance. Let's talk about implementation, because theory without a system is just entertainment. The first and most important thing to understand about building the 72-hour habit is that you cannot do it with willpower alone. That's the whole point. If willpower were reliable, you wouldn't need a rule. You need a monk mode approach to restructuring your relationship with purchasing, and that starts with radical friction engineering, not self-discipline. Monk mode is a concept worth taking seriously. It's the deliberate, temporary adoption of severe constraints for the purpose of recovering cognitive resources and breaking automated behavioral patterns. When a monk enters a monastery, the rules aren't primarily about deprivation. They're about the elimination of decision fatigue. When every major decision has been pre-made, what to eat, when to sleep, what to wear, what to spend, the mind stops consuming bandwidth on those low-level decisions and becomes available for deeper processing. In practical terms, monk mode for the 72-hour rule looks like this. First, remove saved payment information from every online retailer. All of them. This is not about making buying impossible, it's about adding friction. Research on friction in behavioral economics is unambiguous. Every additional step between desire and purchase reduces conversion rate. That's why Amazon built one-click purchasing. You're going to unbuild it. Remove the cards. Force yourself to type the number manually. That 30-second friction is, psychologically, a 72-hour runway. Most impulse purchases evaporate in the time it takes to find your wallet. Second, and this is the part that feels extreme but isn't, delete shopping apps from your phone. Not just disable notifications, delete them. Install a desktop-only rule. You can browse for items you need on your laptop with deliberate intent, but you cannot browse on your phone, which is the device most associated with boredom-driven, stress-driven, and attention gap purchasing. The phone-to-buy pipeline is specifically engineered for impulse velocity. Break the pipeline. Third, create a want list, a simple document, a note on your phone, a whiteboard, where you write down every item you want to buy. Date it, add the price, walk away. This does two things simultaneously. It validates the desire. You're not suppressing the want, you're recording it. And it starts the 72-hour clock. After 3 days, you review the list. Statistically, more than half the items will feel noticeably less compelling. Some will feel actively stupid. A few will still make genuine sense, and those you can buy with full rational buy-in, rather than dopamine-compromised urgency. This is the beginning of building what Charlie Munger would call a latticework of mental models around your own financial behavior. But the list alone, the rule alone, is only the first layer. The deeper transformation requires something more structural. The reason most financial advice fails is that it addresses spending behavior without addressing the identity architecture that drives spending behavior. People don't buy things randomly. They buy things that reflect a story they're telling themselves about who they are, who they're becoming, what they deserve, what will make them feel whole. The person who impulse buys fitness equipment is telling a story about the person they're going to become. The person who impulse buys luxury items they can't afford is telling a story about the person they believe they're supposed to be. The person who buys small, cheap, frequent things they don't need is often self-medicating a story about not having enough. None of these stories can be fixed by a budgeting app. They can only be interrupted and then slowly replaced by building what investors call a moat around your own identity. The concept of the moat comes from Warren Buffett's investment philosophy. A business worth owning has a durable competitive advantage, a moat, that protects it from being eroded by competition. A mediocre business with no moat gets ground down by market forces over time. A person's financial identity works the same way. If your identity around money is thin, if it's just, I'm trying to be better, then the first temptation, the first sale, the first peer purchase signals will erode it immediately. You need a moat. You need an identity that is robust enough to withstand the pressure of an entire industry designed to breach it. Building that moat starts with the intersection of rare skills. Not one skill, not expertise in a single area, but the deliberate combination of 2 or 3 domains that individually are not unique, but together form a competitive identity that is almost impossible to replicate. A person who understands behavioral psychology, personal finance, and communication can build an audience and a practice that a pure financial advisor cannot. A person who understands coding and design and sales psychology can build products that a pure developer cannot. The same principle applies to the identity you build around money. Your moat in this context is, I am someone who understands how my brain is being manipulated, who has a system for evaluating purchases under clarity rather than stress, and who makes financial decisions from a position of deliberate intent rather than reflexive response. That's not a rule, that's an identity. An identity is far more durable than rules. Here's the uncomfortable social dimension of this work, and it needs to be said plainly because most financial advice dances around it. Your current social environment may be the single greatest threat to your financial transformation. Not the algorithm, not your credit card interest rate, the people you spend time with. There's a phenomenon in social psychology sometimes described as the crabs in a bucket effect. If you put crabs in a bucket, they will pull each other down. Not out of malice, out of instinct. When one crab tries to climb, the others grab it and drag it back. The same behavior exists in human social groups, and it is most pronounced in groups where financial struggle is the shared identity. When you announce you're going to stop buying things impulsively, someone in your life will make fun of it. When you stop going to dinner every weekend because you're redirecting that money toward debt, someone will call you cheap or antisocial. When you start talking about investing, about assets, about building wealth, someone will find that threatening because your ambition implicitly challenges their inertia. This is not personal, it is gravitational. The people around you exert social gravity. They do not need to be malicious to pull you back. They simply need to be stationary while you're trying to move. And the psychological force of social belonging, of being one of the group, of not standing out, of not making other people uncomfortable with your choices, is one of the most powerful forces acting against personal financial transformation. It has ended more financial plans than any market crash. The solution is not to abandon your relationships. The solution is to build a parallel social environment, populated by people whose values and behaviors align with who you're becoming. In practice, this means that if you cannot find those people physically in your current life, you find them in books, in lectures, in podcasts, in recorded conversations with people who have already thought through what you're now beginning to think through. You make Charlie Munger your morning commute companion. You make Morgan Housel your Sunday afternoon reading. You make Nassim Taleb the voice in your head that challenges your assumptions about risk. These are not substitutes for real relationships, but they are a cognitive environment that reinforces your identity moat rather than eroding it. One book read seriously, annotated, argued with, applied, does more for your financial psychology than a year of passive scrolling through personal finance content. This is not because books are magic. It's because deep engagement with a coherent worldview from someone who has tested it against reality rewires your associative networks in ways that passive consumption cannot. When Buffett says, price is what you pay, value is what you get, and you've turned that sentence over in your mind for a month, you hear it in your head the next time you see a flash sale. When you've internalized Mulanathan and Shafir's scarcity research, you recognize the cognitive distortion when it's happening to you in real time. That recognition is the beginning of agency. Now let's talk about where all of this leads. Because the 72-hour rule, properly understood, is not a spending control technique. It is a capital accumulation mechanism. And the mathematics of capital accumulation, of compound interest operating in your favor rather than against you, is the argument that makes everything else we've discussed not just interesting, but urgent. Here's the math, stated plainly. The average American in the middle quintile of income earns roughly $60,000 per year. If over the course of their working life, they could redirect just 10% of their income from consumption spending to invested capital, from things that depreciate to assets that appreciate. The compound growth on that capital would be transformative. 10% of 60,000 is $6,000 per year. At a conservative 7% annualized return, roughly what a broad index fund has returned historically, adjusted for inflation, $6,000 per year invested for 30 years compounds to approximately $600,000. Not from exceptional income, from the reallocation of consumption into compounding. Now run the counterfactual. The same $6,000 per year, if it goes onto a credit card at 22% and is only minimally serviced, compounds against you. Not for you. At 22%, debt doubles in roughly 3.5 years. At 7%, investments double in roughly 10 years. The difference between the two sides of that equation, between being someone compound interest works for versus against, is not income. It is behavioral. It is the discipline, supported by systems, to interrupt the automatic pathway between want and buy. The 72-hour rule, applied consistently, across $3,000 in annual impulse spending, with the redirected capital invested rather than consumed, doesn't save you $3,000 per year. It builds you $600,000 over 30 years. And that number is conservative because it doesn't account for the additional spending you avoid by not carrying the stress of debt, not paying the premium prices associated with financial fragility, not absorbing the cognitive cost of financial scarcity. The person who operates on the asset side of the ledger thinks about money differently at a foundational level, not because they're better people, because they've crossed a threshold. They've achieved something like financial escape velocity, a point at which compound interest is working for them rather than against them, at which the mathematics of the system has flipped from adversarial to cooperative. From that position, the question of whether to buy something shifts. It's no longer, can I afford this? It's, what is the opportunity cost of this, in terms of the compounded return of that capital over the next decade? A person with $100,000 in invested assets who spends $1,000 on an impulse purchase is not spending $1,000. At a 7% annual return, that $1,000 over 20 years would have become roughly $3,860. The real cost of the purchase is the future value of the capital. This is how wealthy people think about money. Not because they're frugal, but because they've internalized the mathematics deeply enough that the opportunity cost is as viscerally real to them as the present tense pleasure of the purchase. This is not a natural cognitive ability. It's a trained one. And the 72-hour rule is, among other things, a training mechanism for that kind of thinking. When you wait 72 hours and you come back to a purchase decision with a cooler head, you begin asking different questions. Not just, do I want this? But what else could this $100 become? Not just, is this worth it? But is this the highest value use of this capital at this moment? Over time, those questions stop feeling like discipline. They become automatic. They become your new default operating system for evaluating consumption decisions. And when that shift happens, when your brain starts running the opportunity cost calculation as its first response, rather than its last resort, you have begun the process of building genuine financial intelligence. This is not the end of the journey, it's the beginning. But the beginning matters enormously, because almost everyone who has ever built meaningful financial security started from exactly where you are right now, understanding for the first time that the system was not designed to help you, that the forces acting against your financial health are structural and biological rather than personal, and that the first move is not to work harder or earn more, but to build a system that makes the right behavior the path of least resistance. The 72-hour rule is that system in its simplest form. You do not need to be a financial genius. You do not need exceptional income. You do not need a trust fund or a stock tip or a life-changing opportunity. You need 72 hours of patience, applied consistently, over years, directed by a coherent understanding of what your brain is doing and why, reinforced by an identity that is robust enough to survive social gravity and dopamine pressure. There's a line from Viktor Frankl that applies here, even though he was writing about something far more serious than spending behavior. Between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space lies our freedom. The 72-hour rule is that space. Engineered, systematized, protected from the forces that want to close it. The cage you're sitting in has an open door. It always has. The door is 72 hours wide, and on the other side of it is every version of your financial life that you have been postponing in favor of the next purchase. The algorithm wants your next click to happen in the next 30 seconds. It wants the decision to be made while your cortisol is elevated and your prefrontal cortex is half asleep. It wants you to buy before you can think. You have exactly one response that costs nothing, requires no willpower, breaks no relationships, and has the potential to compound into financial freedom over the course of a single decade. Wait 72 hours, every single time, without exception. Not because you're suppressing desire, not because you're punishing yourself, but because you understand now, at a level that goes beyond advice and into mechanism, that the person who decides at hour 72 is a fundamentally different person, chemically, neurologically, financially, than the one who is about to click buy now. That person is you, the real you, the one who isn't being manipulated, and that version of you makes better decisions every time. The information in your hands right now is free. The system to apply it costs nothing but time. The compounding return on applying it is worth, over a lifetime, more money than most people earn in a decade of work. The gravity is real. The escape velocity is achievable. The clock starts the next time you open a cart. 72 hours. Start there.